Yes.
So, Dr. Galea, I'm just going to ask you a few general questions about Dundee, and then turn to some of the work that you did in Inverness and Dundee and donor counselling and look back and so on, which will bring us to the end of my questions. So, the same question that I asked you in respect of Inverness, can you give us a sort of pen picture of the centre at Dundee and the what you met when you went there and the challenges that you faced?
Yeah, Dundee was a bigger centre, about the same size as Aberdeen. The big challenge for me in Dundee was that it was a time when SMBTS was changing from having 5 fully independent, if you like, transfusion centres, where each centre did its own processing and testing, to shifting the processing and testing to Edinburgh and Glasgow. So the Dundee, Aberdeen and Inverness blood centres lost that capability. This was a time of great insecurity for the staff. Some people had to lose their jobs. Some had to change their functions completely. So my role there really was to manage that change. There was also a new blood center, a new donation center being refurbished. And similarly, although by now I had learned quite a few management skills, I had to learn all about the new management team, keep the show on the road, make sure that the blood came in, and so on and so forth. So that was my real main challenge in Dundee.
Just to ask you a little bit of detail about the centralisation of the processing of blood. Once that had moved to the central belt to Edinburgh and Glasgow, is it right to understand that all donations that were collected by any of the regional transfusion centres were sent for all testing for viral infections to Edinburgh or Glasgow before being released? Is that correct?
So they were all sent as whole blood as they were collected, and then they were processed in Edinburgh or Glasgow, tested in Edinburgh or Glasgow, and then sent back our pro rata share, if you like, of what we needed.
So no more making your own fresh frozen plasma, no more making your own cryoprecipitate. All of that was done centrally.
Yeah.
And so effectively your laboratories were decommissioned, were they, and staff made redundant?
That would change yours completely. Yeah.
Do you think that hospitals would have noticed a difference to the arrangements? That they were presumably still getting components from you, the product from you. Would they have noticed a difference, do you think?
We had many discussions with them because they required a lot of reassurance that they felt that, they had been getting such a good service from before, where if they phoned for platelets, at 2 a.m, they got them because they were there. They wanted that same reassurance that if the processing and testing was going to be transferred, they would still going to get the same level of service from us as before. And therefore, that required a lot of discussions with them, a lot of reassurance with them, a lot of meetings with them. Once the transition happened, I think it was generally very smooth.
And what did you understand to be the aims of centralisation?
Well, I think it was partly cost saving, I suppose. 2, improving the standardization. So you only have 2 centers doing processing and testing rather than 5. In fact, I think PCR testing of all donations was done only in 1 center in Glasgow. So I think, rationalization of services, cost saving, and harmonization.
Now, I understand that we'll look at the article where this information comes from, but in July 1997, all centres in Scotland introduced the Tickbox Questionnaire for use in donor sessions. Is that right?
I mean, I can't remember the exact date, but if you've got that date, then that's what it was, yeah.
Can we just look at that? It's NHBT 000444271_003. So is it right to understand that this is a document that would be provided to the donor to fill in themselves, because we've got there, they need to sign it in various, they need to sign a declaration that they've read the blood safety leaflet, and they declare to the best of their knowledge they're not at risk of infection. That's on the left-hand side on declaration by donors, and that their blood can be tested, and that they understand the nature of the procedure and the associated risks involved, as explained in the blood donation leaflet, and so on. And they also are asked to consent to their general practitioner being able to give information to the blood transfusion service. So sorry.
I'm not 100% sure, but I suspect this might be an English version. I am not 100% sure that we actually asked for the GP's name in our version. Okay. But I think that's the only difference. Otherwise, as I indicated before, the questions are in sequential order, ever in the past year, in the past 6 months, and so on. So I do recognize that this being the Tickbox Questionnaire, which had to be ticked every time by every donor.
And it had to be ticked by, so we can see in the Tickbox Questionnaire part, there's yes, no, and staff use. Is it right to understand that the donor would be given this and they would be expected to do the ticking in the yes and no, and then
That's right.
Once they'd signed it, it would be given to a staff member who then had the ability to write something, if necessary, in the staff use column?
Yes, and if they were first-time donors, then that would be the basis for the personal interview.
And so I'm just going to come on to personal interviews, but this tick box questionnaire would be given to all donors, would it? Repeat donors and first-time donors?
Yep.
And we can see in the tick box questionnaire section, at section 7, we can see their mention of CJD. Can you recall whether or not that came into the questions that were put to donors at the time that the tick box questionnaire came out, or whether that had formed part of the questioning of donors prior to that?
No, I mean, I can't. 97 appears about right. Clearly here we're talking about CJD, not the variant form, which came later. And
this is a revision dated the 19th of January, 1988. So 98. So it may follow on from an earlier version. So 1997
Yes.
may not be quite right.
Yes.
I cannot remember when that question was introduced. I was trying to explain that had to do with the classical CJD variant, with classical CJD, not the variant, because in the classical type, there are some people who have a family history of CJD, unfortunately, and they would know about it. And there was a lot of debate in the donor SAC as to whether to ask this question to everybody. And ultimately, it was decided that if people had a family history of CJD, they would know about it, because it's not something that happens by chance, and therefore it was a question which we felt they could answer.
And then we can see that all donors are asked to answer some questions, and first-time donors or donors who haven't been given for 2 years are asked to answer other questions. And then there is the warnings on the right-hand side for all donors, the groups of people that shouldn't give blood, and that echoes the material that we've looked at before, but it includes not only those who are HIV, but also those who are hepatitis B or hepatitis C, if they carry the hepatitis B or hepatitis C virus, and then the other categories set out there. And then they're asked to say, is it possible that any of the above might apply to you? And asked to say yes or no there. And then at the bottom of that part, there is an opportunity, we come out of that box, there's an opportunity right at the bottom there to, do you wish to speak to a nurse in confidence? Do you wish to speak in confidence to a doctor or nurse? So there was opportunity, was there, by the time this revision came out, which is correctly identified as January 1998, for there to be private confidential discussions between donors and staff?
Yeah, we were very aware that, we were dealing with very sensitive topics here, about personal behaviors and so on. So although many people felt comfortable to ticking a box, some people might feel that, somebody might see them or a friend might see them ticking a box. And in that case, we wanted to make sure that at every session, there was an area which was completely private. And I remember, having radio background noise so that nobody could listen to the discussion. So that if somebody wanted to speak in confidence to winners, they had the opportunity to do so in private.
And so did that have an impact on the places that you could go to hold donor sessions?
I can't remember specifically whether it was, whether some specific places couldn't be used anymore, but we did make sure that wherever we went, in halls and so on, there were a number of measures that had to be looked at in terms of health and safety, in terms of availability of water, availability of a private area, and so on and so forth. So yes, they had to have a place where a donor could speak confidentially to one of our staff. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a good place to have a blood donation session.
And I'm going to come on in a moment to look at the audit that you did of the use of this questionnaire, but I'm going to turn first of all to the introduction of the donor interview, the personal donor interview process, and look at that, and then because you audited those two things together. So can we turn first of all, please, to STHB 30677. So 400677. I haven't given you enough zeros. Sorry, Paul. Right. So this is the meeting of the Medical and Scientific Committee from March 1993, and we can see that you were present. And if we turn over to page 7, please, we can see at the top there, donor selection procedures, intensive interviewing. And the members noted that data from the USA suggests that face-to-face interviews with donors significantly enhances high-risk donor exclusion. The benefits of computer interviewing were mentioned, and it was agreed that careful consideration of costs would be required. Dr. Galea reported that a meeting of the donor consultants with representatives of the microbiology reference unit is to be held in the summer to assess the results of the evaluation exercise which had been underway in SEBTS. Dr. Galea will report back to MSC thereafter. Are you there? The evaluation exercise underway in SEBTS, is that what eventually you wrote up with?
Yes.
And we'll come to that in due course. So is that, this is 1993, so it's clearly an early MSC meeting for you because you've just been appointed at Inverness. But as far as you are aware, is this when this idea about intensive interviewing was first discussed by the directors, or had that been an issue previously?
I can't remember the exact dates because I used to attend before just as a medical advisor, but I suspect it's about the right time, 1993, because we had conducted the audit in Edinburgh and Aberdeen. Edinburgh and the South East had been piloting personal donor interviews in some of their sessions, which actually was the data of which reflected in my study, which showed that personal donor interviews were pretty effective, particularly in eliciting high-risk behavior. So I suspect that must be one of the very first times that it was discussed.
And you say you were piloting the donor interview. Were you doing that in Aberdeen?
No, the piloting was when we did the audit, Edinburgh were piloting it, and in Aberdeen we weren't. Then I think after the results were widely disseminated, it was accepted that, and for the other reasons that I mentioned earlier today, availability of doctors, etc. I think a move by SMBTS was that, yes, personal donor interviews are a good idea to try to implement throughout Scotland.
And then we don't need to turn up these documents, but the documents that we have show that following this, there's a decision made in May 1994 to accept personal interviews should be introduced, and thereafter there's discussion about when that could be introduced, and at one stage it suggested that it should be introduced in different centres at different times, and then in October 1995 funding was released which would allow the same start date in all of the centres, and that start date was set as September 1996. Does that accord with your recollection?
Probably. I think when I went in Dundee, which was in '96, it was just about or just about to be introduced. So yes, that 1996 would be a correct date.
And it was agreed that some prevalence data would be collected to effectively audit the use of this interview.
I did that in my region when I went to Dundee, and we introduced personal donor interviews. I followed it up. I did a year's study because we had just introduced the Tickbox Questionnaire for all donors and personal donor interviews for first-time donors. And you could see, if you look at the data before and after, it confirmed yet again that personal donor interviews were very effective in eliciting information about high-risk behavior or data about the blood safety leaflet. And I think that confirmed all the previous work that was done, which showed that they are really effective in this context.
Shall we look then at the article you published in Transfusion Medicine? It's WITN 6931003. So this is the impact of the new Tickbox Questionnaire and the personal donor interview on donor deferrals in the east of Scotland. And if we just read the summary, it says the impact of a new Tickbox Questionnaire and personal donor interview on donor and recipient safety was assessed over an 18-month and a 13-month period, respectively, by prospectively studying individual donors prior to and after the introduction of the new methodology. A hit was defined as an instance where the TBQ or the PDI prompted a donor to divulge information which they would not otherwise have divulged, with the new information having an impact on donor eligibility. There was a hit rate of 0 to 19% for TBQ and 0 to 65% for PDI. Of those donors, 33% in the TBQ category and 14% of PDIs were reinstated. 24% and 32% respectively were deferred because of a malaria Chagas risk, and 16% of the hits related to donor safety issues. When assessing recipient safety, particularly risk of a window period viral transmission, PDI is very significantly superior at identifying such donors, 14 times better. Such information establishes the important safety aspects of these interventions and requires that further work be done to see whether PDIs in particular may be better targeted to specific groups of donors. And then just to get the dates of this, if we look down the right-hand column, materials and methods, it says there that the Tickbox Questionnaire, which is printed on the back of the donor session record, was introduced to all donors in July 1997. If we go over the page to the left-hand column, we can see it 2 there at the top. During the late 1990s, SMBTS also decided to phase in the introduction of the personal donor interview on a region-by-region basis. PDI for the first time in 2-year lapsed donors was introduced in the east of Scotland region in January 98, and this interview, undertaken by a nurse or doctor, allows careful review of the responses to the TBQ, followed by direct oral questions regarding possible risk behaviour. is that right? It started in the east of, in Edinburgh first, and then other centres followed suit.
Yeah, yeah. And when I went to Dundee, as I say, I'm not quite sure exactly why, but the previous director did not implement it at the time. So having done it before in Inverness, I felt, well, it is something which I have a quick experience of. I know SMBTS want to do it. So within a few months of me arriving in Dundee, I began to implement the changes to introduce the Tickbox Questionnaire for everybody and the personal donor interviews for first-time and lapsed donors.
And in terms of donor response to being asked questions, sometimes quite personal questions about their risk behaviour, were donors surprised, upset, angry, any of the above, at questions being directed to them in respect to those matters?
No, in general, the response was very positive. I think the trick is to train the staff really well how to handle these issues, because as you say, they're very personal issues. You don't know the donor very well, you're meeting him for a very short period of time. So you have to handle these things very sensitively. But in general, most donors felt that these questions were being asked to improve blood safety. So it was more of a positive response rather than, why are you inquiring about my personal life?
So key is training the staff, but key is also to have very strong messaging to the donors that this is not a personal attack on them. These questions are being asked for blood safety reasons.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm going to move on now from donor selection issues and ask you some questions about look back, and that's my final topic for today. So can I ask you, can we look first please at PRSE 40796? This is a letter 15th of October 1993 to all of the centre directors. So you are then in post in Inverness. And it says, look back, one of the outcomes of the recent HCV symposium at the RCPE was that there is a need to refer patients who have recently acquired HCV infection to specialists for consideration as to whether they should have early interferon therapy. I do believe this places an obligation on the BTS to use its best endeavours to advise clinical colleagues accordingly when we have evidence that a recipient may have acquired HCV. It's my intention to raise this matter at our next MSc, and I would be most grateful if you would discuss it with your medical team so that our MSc discussion reflects all professional views throughout the service. Can you remember whether there was a practice when you first arrived in Inverness and at the time that you received this letter of carrying out any kind of ad hoc look back? So, for example, if you did find a donor that had tested positive for HCV, whether there was a practice of trying to identify what had happened to any previous donations?
I think in the context of HCV, I think that was the case, but only on an ad hoc basis. So if we find one, then you would look back and see, yes, whether the blood that was taken was still in stock, whether it was transfused, whether it was sent to PFC. You would notify accordingly. So if it went for fractionation, you would notify the fractionation center. If the blood was still in the unit, in the RTC, it would be destroyed. And if unfortunately it was transfused, we would notify the clinician. So on an ad hoc basis, yes, we did that.
So can we look next then at a document which at PRSE 303344. So this is a document relating to the National Look Back. National Look Back programme. So this is some 8 months after the letter from Professor Cash that we just looked at, again to all of the centre directors, and HCV look-back programme, I thought it might be helpful to clarify the position at 20 June 1994 after the unusual events following our last MSC meeting. Just pausing there, maybe too much to ask you this, but can you recall what the unusual events were around that time?
Sorry, I can't. I'm trying to think, but no, I can't remember, unfortunately.
And then he says this: there are likely to be 3 evolving approaches designed to provide the now necessary SOHHD approval for the SMBTS to commence a formal nationwide HCV look-back programme. So again, pausing there, it looks like by this stage, the Home and Health Department approval is required for the National Look-Back Programme. Is that what you understood to be the case?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
And then he says these approaches can be summarised as follows. So first of all, he sets out that the Advisory Committee on the Transfusion Transmitted Diseases will need to make a recommendation to the MBA, and an extraordinary meeting is going to be called to consider the topic as soon as possible. And then if we go over the page, he looks, next page. The other 2 strands there are the donor consultant group, the group that you chaired, and it says that you have kindly agreed that that group will act as the focus for an emerging draft SMBTS operational plan, which in due course will be submitted to the MSC for approval, and thence via David McIntosh, hopefully, to the Home and Health Department. And it would be my intention to attend those meetings in order to provide the best possible communication between the service and ACTTI. And then lastly, he believes it's operationally important and in patients' interest that we, the SMBTS, consult with senior hepatologists on this topic, and I'm certain that even across Scotland this will enhance our ability to achieve an orderly and optimal approach. The plan would be to acquire as much advice as possible with regard to the practical consequences of an HCV look-back programme. So we'll pick up in a moment by looking at a document, what's set out in paragraph 2. Can you recall whether or not you did indeed consult with hepatology colleagues and what their response was to the HCV look-back programme?
I can say what I did. I definitely consulted with the local hepatologist, because the issue, of course, was there's no point identifying these recipients if there was nobody to see them urgently, because you had just given them a bit of bad news, clearly, and they had to be seen pretty urgently. So I met with, I think it was 1 or 2 hematologists in Dundee, and they agreed that, if it was a recipient and that was notified of being infected, and if the consultant who was in charge of their care notified them and they would know that they were part of the look-back program, that they would see them pretty urgently. So that was my buffer, if you like, my fallback position. Once we began the look back, I'm not quite sure what happened afterwards because that wasn't my remit anymore. But I wanted to make sure that there was somebody available to see these recipients of blood pretty urgently.
And then if we pick up what's said in paragraph 2 there, the operational plan, could we look please at SBTS 40462_011. We've got there a document entitled SNPTS Guidelines for HCV Lookback, Dr. G. Galea, and then there's some handwritten notes on there to Jack. So I don't know whether you know what those are or who wrote them.
I mean, that's for Jack Gillen because he was part of the group. I don't know who wrote it. Maybe it's Brian. I'm not sure.
Okay. So if we go over the page then, please, to page 2, we can see the HCV Lookback programme. So is it right to understand that these are effectively the operational guidelines that Professor Cash mentioned in that letter we just looked at?
Yes.
And so you say on February 1st and 2nd, the donor consultants group met and discussed in detail the HCV Lookback programme. And at A, it was agreed that the UK BTS proposal were a targeted look back. And B, reasonable efforts should be made to trace all recipients where appropriate and possible. This may include the use of archived donor samples to assist with their targeting of individuals involved. Is that was that when you found a positive donor, you would go back and test the archive samples to see when
Yes.
when the infection arose and which donations were infected, effectively?
Yes, because we kept all the archives, and therefore we could trace exactly at what point the donor should have converted. Clearly, if he was a previous donor, if he had given previous donations. So we could trace back until we got a negative donation, and therefore we could then know which recipients to go and find out.
And then you set out what the MBA are doing, which is that they're not using archive samples and the reasons why they're not. C, it's essential to establish that the recipient is alive before any attempt is made to contact them. D, the original prescribing physician should be physician should be informed in the first instance, followed soon after by the recipient's GP if the patient is still under the original prescriber's care. If the recipient is not under the original prescriber's care any longer, the GP will be contacted first. A BTS consultant for each region will be responsible for the Look Back programme. G, since Dr. Gillen is updating the HCV counselling document on a UK-wide basis, it was felt that the same document should be used throughout Scotland. So just pausing there, is that referring to the HCV counselling document that we looked at to be used for donors, or is this a different counselling document specifically for Look Back?
I think it's a combination. So you have the counselling document for donors, but we also had very detailed procedures as to how we go about tracing the recipients of blood as part of this Look Back program. So it's, it was a combined document, if you like, or two combined documents. One was how to counsel a donor, and the other one was how to actually do the Look Back program to identify the recipients and what to do with them.
And then if we go over the page, we can see the action by RTCs.
Yeah, that's...
And is this the detail that you were just mentioning?
Yes.
So all reference laboratory confirmed HCV antibody positive donors to be identified and their donor record examined. Next paragraph, all donations given prior to the index HCV antibody positive donation to be identified by donation number, together with all the unfractionated blood components prepared from these previous donations. And then you have to establish the fate of all of the previously donated units and their components. You've got to list out all the components issued to each hospital, which has got to provide the donation number, the type of component, the date of issue, etc., etc. And then it says that the donor consultant group do not believe that patients exposed to IVIG need to be contacted and tested. This is not part of a targeted look back. So again, just pausing there, was that a decision made by the donor consultant group, or was that a decision made by the SMBTS, or indeed by the Home and Health Department, that the targeted look back didn't include IVIG recipients?
Remember, this paper is part of a document that is going to MSC. So these were recommendations by the donor consultants group. This was discussed at MSC. I do not believe, although I may be wrong, but I do not believe it went to the Scottish office because of the well-known safety issues that were concerned. IVIG is, when it's processed and fractionated, is a very safe product. To my knowledge, there has been no transmissions ever of hepatitis C through it, and therefore, because it was a very safe product, there would have been no need to actually trace those recipients. So I'm pretty sure that this was approved by MSC. I wouldn't have thought it would have gone to the Scottish Department, Health Department.
And then the document goes on to set out that the hospital where the infected product component was provided to the patient must contact the patient And then at that bottom large paragraph, halfway down, it says a letter is sent for the haematologist to send to the hospital clinician, and a letter for the clinician to send to the patient. So it looks like part of the process was to have standard letters for hospitals to provide to the patients. Is that right?
I think so. And actually, I believe, if my memory serves me well, this was a UK-wide initiative. It wasn't just for SMBTS. Standard templates were produced, standard letters were produced. So I think it was a big attempt, I think, to have a unified approach in this. And I'm pretty sure that even the templates and the letters were UK-wide. Obviously, you then had to adapt them to your personal circumstances. So you would have, the SMBTS logo on top and so on. But the content and the letter itself were drafted, I think, on a UK-wide basis.
And then if we go over the page, we get to the section Other Notes. And if we look at 2, we can see there it says the donor consultants group felt that counselling of donors, and it says question mark recipients, which I think must be right.
Yeah. That must be recipients, yeah.
Should be done by the physician under whose care they are, either in hospital or their GP. As a last resort, however, following consultation with either, it was felt by the SMBTS consultants that adequate care was not being given to particular recipients, then they may be involved in counselling such recipients either pre or post-testing. Do you recall whether or not that occurred in either of the centres that you were a director of?
No. No, it didn't happen. The hematologists that were involved, I mean, clearly it wasn't 100% proof program. I mean, some donations we could not trace fully, but those that we did, and it was the majority of them, and a significant majority, the hematologists or the clinician in charge of the patient who still knew the patient agreed to give them the news, which made a lot of sense. I mean, because the clinician in charge of the patient knew the patient. They wouldn't have known us at all. And therefore, they had built a much better rapport with the clinician in charge, and therefore, it would have been much better, and it made complete sense that they told them the news. And this was agreed beforehand. They didn't receive this letter just out of the blue. Everybody knew that the lookback program was going to take place. And sometimes we used to, if I got a recipient or I knew of a recipient, before sending the letter, I would phone up the clinician and I would say, we have found a person who has probably been transfused with HIV-infected blood. Do you know him? Are you happy to talk to him? And so on. I would make contact. I would liaise with the clinician himself.
And can you recall how easy or difficult the centres found it to do everything that they were expected to do in terms of going back and finding the right archive samples to test, and then from there working out where the donations were and where they went and so on?
It wasn't an easy task. It was very laborious. Many of the records were manual as well, because they were computerization. So, it wasn't an easy process to go through all the notes and try to identify the recipients. In my case, where I was in Dundee and in Inverness, numbers were small. I suspect if you were working in a big center, it would have been it wouldn't have been an easy task to do this work. Very labor intensive, very detailed. You have to go to the notes and so on and so forth, trace the patients, look at the numbers, look at the donations, get the archive samples tested. It was a significant piece of work.
And if we can turn to SBTS 40463_005. So we can see this is a meeting of the Medical and Science Committee of 17th of May 1995, and again we can see that you're present. If we can turn please to page 5, there's a section entitled HCV Look Back. The first paragraph there, I just want to get your recollection of this. There was agreement that the implementation process had been problematic, with delays, misunderstandings in receipt of documentation from SHHD and typographical factual errors in the content of standard letters, e.g. North East region letters had gone from SSHD to GPs but not hospital MOs, which resulted in numerous phone calls to the RTC. Nevertheless, good progress was being made across the SNBTS, and they go on to review the position, which I'll come to in a moment. But can you remember whether you experienced any of these, what looked like being articulated as teething problems?
I would say maybe some teething problems, yes. But in general, nothing sticks up in my mind which says it was very difficult to do or to achieve. I think, you have these teething problems, maybe wrong letters or maybe wrong fonts or something like that. But in general, I don't think personally we found it very difficult. And then if we...
sorry, I interrupted you.
No, I was going to say where I worked in Dundee, because that's where I was at the time when this was happening.
And then if we go, it says review of current position, and it starts with Belfast, but if we go over the page, this document is actually dated 17th of May 1995, so I think you must have been in Inverness at that stage.
Sorry, okay, yeah.
And we can see the north, all donations had been traced back as far as records would allow, 1979. All available archive samples had been tested, and this demonstrated 2 seroconversions. The look-back process was restricted to positives and the last true negative. So just pausing there, is it right to understand then that rather than this being a look-back that arises as the donors are being new donors are being screened, you're actually going back through all the archive samples? It's not a question of a donor walking through the door, having an HCV test for their donation as standard practice and realising they've got HCV, so then going to the archive samples. Are you searching through the archive samples?
We looked for all the HCV positives that were ever found and looked back at all the archive samples and see how many of them were positive, and we kept on testing, in this case up to 1979, which is a long time back, to identify which was the first negative donation. And then we could say all the previous donations prior to that, after that, we need to find where they went.
So the trigger for looking through the archive samples was a donor walking through the door, having a donation taken and being found to be HCV positive?
That was, yes, but yes, absolutely. So anybody who was positive, we then looked back at all the previous donations before.
And then you say of 11 patients still alive, so can you just help me to understand that? You've demonstrated 2 seroconversions, but then you talk of 11 patients still being alive. So are we to understand that that is 11 patient recipients from the 2 seroconversions?
Can you repeat that, please, about the seroconversions?
So you say that all available archive samples have been tested, and this demonstrated 2 seroconversions.
Yes.
And so
if there were...
Yes, go.
Sorry.
No, carry on.
I was just going to say, if somebody gave, for example, 10 previous donations, so there was 1 seroconversion between the donation 1 and 2, and there were 9 more, those 9 we then traced back. Some, obviously, some blood would not have been given. Some blood would have been discarded. Some blood would have been given to patients. And we then traced all the recipients that got the blood. As I said, there is one caveat to that, and that sometimes if we gave out blood and the blood didn't come back, then we assumed it was transfused. But we felt, better tell somebody that he might be infected and then be negative, rather than miss him. Because if we had no proof that the blood was not transfused, then you either say, well, I don't know where it's gone, or you try and trace that patient so that blood went out for patient X. We don't have proof. We still tell patient X that he might have been infected, because then as soon as the result comes back that he's negative, then his mind is put at rest, if we don't tell him, he might be positive and he would never know. So we felt better be precautionary and test everybody.
So just looking back at this document then, so of the 2 seroconversions, you had managed to trace from the donations that they had, the infected donations that they had given, 11 alive patients, 5 of whom had been contacted, and then another 10 components that had been sent to other centres and they had been contacted.
Yes.
Can you then help me with this? STHB 40687. So this, we're moving on now from this document we just looked at was May 1985, and 1995. And we're moving on now to a document, again, meeting of the Medical and Scientific Committee in October 1995. Again, you're present. And if we turn to page 4, just if you can help me to understand what's said there under 4 HCV look back, and then if we could go down, please, to little 4. With respect to recipients of blood components pre-HCV testing, the MSC agreed that testing of available donor archive samples would be neither cost-effective nor appropriate. So here, is it right that we're talking about whether or not there should be testing of archive samples not triggered by a current donor coming in and being found to be HCV positive, but simply, well, not simply, but the transfusion centre going back through its archives to see if they can find any donations that might be positive.
Exactly, yeah. That's why we called it a targeted look back rather than to a general look back where you go and test. I mean, remember, we were collecting about 300,000 donations per year. So to test all that would have been monumental and probably not cost effective at all because, you know, the numbers you're going to find were very, very small.
And so what's said there is that, that an offer to test anyone who had received blood components or products prior to HCV screening was likely to be the most effective option, that this latter option should not be pursued until the present HCV look-back exercise was substantively complete, and that the sample collection and testing process should be provided by the blood transfusion services. Now, can you recall whether or not this subsequent look back or offer, sorry, to test anyone who'd received blood components or products prior to HCV screening, was that offered during your time in the blood transfusion service, so before 1999?
To my recollection, it wasn't offered as a service by SMBTS. It may have been offered by the clinicians, but to my knowledge, it wasn't something which we, as a donation, as a blood transfusion service, offered. No, I don't think so.
And can you recall whether there was any subsequent discussion about that, about this, what's said here? So once you'd got to sort of the end of the look back, whether that was brought back to the table?
I don't recollect any more discussion after that. Then no. Particularly after 1999, when then I moved into tissues and so on. So it could have been discussed in the context of blood, but I can't recall it being discussed, no.
So those are the questions that I wished to ask Dr. Galea. The core participants and their legal representatives will no doubt need some time to consider whether they want to ask me to put further questions to Dr. Galea. So I wonder whether we could have a break now.
Yes. How long do you think you might need?
I don't know. Shall we try for 20 minutes? And
well, let's make it half an hour, shall we?
Yes.
And come back at 3:20 our time, 4:20 your time, Doctor. The purpose of this is to allow core participants, through their lawyers, to ask Ms. Scott to ask some further questions of you on various topics to which they want answers. And to allow her to field those questions, we just take some time. I can't tell you how long we shall be when we come back. It may be very short, but it may not be. But in any event, I look forward to seeing you back at 4:20 your time, 3:20 us.
Okay, thank you.